job for you, 621.
Hello, and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be discussing Armored Core 6 in fairly comprehensive detail. Before we get started though, I just want to say thank you for clicking on my video, and I truly hope you enjoy what you're going to hear today. I will be discussing each part of Armored Core 6 in more detail throughout the rest of the video, but for those of you who just want to get an initial impression or idea of how the game is so you can move on with your day, I personally recommend this game, even at full price. However, do note a couple of things. If you are not a fan of FromSoft games, don't buy this. If you'll only play through the game once, and thus only get one of the endings, you may be disappointed by the price-to-length ratio. And if you get easily frustrated by difficulty spikes, or you don't like fast-paced third-person combat, you'll want to skip this one. All that being said, however, I do strongly recommend this game if the things I just mentioned are not a problem for you, especially if you enjoy any of those aspects. This game really is a phenomenal experience from start to finish, and although I do have some gripes, they are minor compared to the experience as a whole. But without further ado, let's go ahead and take a critical look at Armored Core 6. Armored Core 6 is a third-person action combat game by legendary studio From Software. I think it bears mentioning, however, that while this game is numbered 6 among the Armored Core series, FromSoft have made significant changes to the AC formula with this release. Now, I am not an expert on this subject, as this is actually the first AC game I have ever played, but I have read many reviews, and it seems like the consensus for longtime fans is that AC6 has undergone a bit of Elden Ringification. That is to say, From Software has taken much of what they've learned with the success of their last decade of game development and applied it to their continuation of the AC series in Armored Core 6. With this in mind, I think there are roughly 3 inevitable responses to this game that will come up. 1, that the game is amazing and does everything a From Software fan wants it to do, albeit with some minor frustrations here and there. 2, that the game is disappointing and doesn't do enough of what the AC Old Guard wants it to do, albeit with some exciting modern presentation and gameplay feel. And 3, that the game is just a big pile of terrible hot garbage, it's too hard, it's too fast, why does From Software keep doing this, and why can't I get past the tutorial boss? As of writing this review, I am currently working on my 3rd playthrough, trying to get the one ending that I'm missing. Having beaten the game twice and being on my way through a 3rd time, I think I've come to align with the first conclusion, although with some acknowledgments to the 2nd and 3rd. I think it is certainly fair to say that this is not an AC game that longtime fans were hoping for, and the difficulty of From Software games is a meme at this point. But, even acknowledging those points, I can't help but keep playing, and that's because at the end of the day, AC6 is just a good video game, something all too rare in the industry today. Now, I could go on and on about From Software as a studio in modern gaming, and why the games they make are important and that their success should be applauded, and I may touch on some of that later, but for now, let's break this game down a little bit further. Let's start by talking about the gameplay. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it fun? Does it make you feel cool? Will it slowly turn you into a mecha weeb? Yes, it is all of these things and much more. In a few words, you will spend the vast majority of your time in this game flying through the air at Mach 6, booster jets blazing behind you at 1,000 degrees, Gatling guns, rocket launchers, and laser cannons laying waste to anyone who would dare even look upon your glorious, deadly majesty. And then you'll come up to a boss. So, if you've read or listened to any other reviews on the game at this point, you'll have probably heard that this game's difficulty is all over the place. And this is actually completely true. There are some missions which will be an absolute breeze, only requiring a few minutes of low-intensity combat against enemies that are significantly less well-armed than you. These enemies, or MTs as they're called, are basically cannon fodder. Along with MTs, you may find yourself fighting some enemies which are plainly called generic weaponry. Thought that was kind of funny. There are several missions where these enemies are pretty much the only thing you'll fight, with a slightly more difficult tetrapod or a couple of LCs thrown in just to make sure you're not sleeping at the wheel. While these missions aren't exactly riveting, they do make you, the player, feel like your character, Raven, a badass, mysterious, almost supernaturally gifted AC pilot raining down destruction without so much as a pause for consideration. These are the parts of the game which some may feel are too easy, and I would agree on the whole, especially when you fly through a mission of this caliber only to be met with a boss that absolutely stomps your ass into the dirt. On the tail end of many missions, you're going to be fighting a boss, and a good handful of these bosses have been the cause of many complaints from players, stating that the difficulty will often spike suddenly and without warning, punctuating a level of smooth and effortless genocide into a brutal and frustrating encounter with a powerful, relentless foe that makes you second guess every design choice that you and the game have made so far. And make no mistake, there is no way past these bosses except through them. To that end, a lot of people have found themselves frustrated to the point of filtering out of the game if they reach a boss they just can't get through. Now, I'm going to take this topic and go on a bit of a tangent for a moment. In this game, you build a mech. This is a huge part of the gameplay. You'll be paid in credits for successfully completing a mission, minus the costs of repairs, ammunition, and any penalties you may have incurred, such as failing part of an objective or switching your AC design mid-mission. With these credits, and with subsequent progress through the game, you'll unlock and be able to purchase an increasingly large variety of weapons. You can make small, fast mechs with low damage melee weapons and handguns, evened out with ridiculous boost speed and energy recharge rates. You can make large, slow mechs with extremely high damaging stun needle launchers, Gatling guns, and rockets, but your boost speed and energy rate will suffer greatly. Or you can go in between, building a middleweight style mech who can do both things well but excel at neither of them. Part of the fun here is mixing and matching parts to create a playstyle that you can enjoy, but that can also succeed at completing missions without putting your investment in the red. Where this ends up falling apart is in its effectiveness and efficiency. There are some missions where your build will not do the trick. You will die too fast, stagger too often, run out of ammo, you won't be fast enough, and the game will demand that you make changes to compensate. If, like me, you've played a lot of other FromSoft games, the only other game in their recent repertoire which felt this way was Sekiro. Play the game the way it's meant to be played or die in frustration. A lot of people don't like this, and I can certainly understand why. However, it's important to note that once you get good at a game like Dark Souls or Elden Ring, you can walk through those games with the same weapons and armor and slap it around no problem. And this is due entirely to your level of skill matching your build's effectiveness. Armored Core 6 doesn't really do that. Yes, you can get good and do no-hit runs, and maybe you'll beat some of the harder encounters without taking damage, running out of ammo, or using a meta build. But if you think you're going to beat the last boss with base AC and a laser dagger, you are sorely mistaken. You have a better chance of beating Dark Souls 1 at SL1 no-hit Broken Straight Sword. AC6 demands that you learn and adapt your playstyle, until you unlock the mini-tank treads, dual Gatlings, and dual stun needle launchers. Then you can beat the game without having to change your build ever again. Okay, rant over, but that is the real reason why people are torn about the difficulty of the game. Some of it just doesn't make sense. My first playthrough, which I unfortunately didn't end up recording, was full of experimentation. I did save every one of my AC designs every time I got stuck or succeeded, which is an amazing feature, by the way. Highly recommend you take use of it. But on my second playthrough, I essentially cheesed my way to the end, basically never changing my build again from start to finish. Did this ruin the fun for me? No. In fact, it made my second playthrough feel extremely rewarding, almost as if this was payment for the amount of struggle that went into my first playthrough. Is it worth your consideration if you decide to do multiple playthroughs? Yes, you will definitely notice the difficulty being all over the place if you go through a second time. And even on my third playthrough, where I'm seeing missions that I haven't seen yet, there are some wild difficulty spikes. Speaking of missions, this game does not have an open world for you to explore. Some of the levels are quite open and do lend themselves to a bit of exploration, but the game is delivered to you in the form of mission-based levels, which you will conduct one at a time. Some of these levels do offer room to explore, but it's not much. Exploration does have some rewards in the form of hidden parts and combat logs, which can all be discovered and unlocked for achievements and extra credits. These things are certainly worth mentioning, as exploring everything fully will get you a little extra playtime, but you'll primarily be rocketing through linear missions which don't variate a whole lot in general. Some missions are short, just a few minutes, and some are longer, maybe 20 or 30 minutes if you end up struggling. I'll separate bosses a bit from the missions that you find them in, as some boss fights can take hours to nail down. This is going to depend on your skill and your ability to build a mech suitable to the task. One thing I'll mention is to pay attention to the dialogue during these difficult sequences. The characters in the game will often give you hints, some subtle and some verbose, as to what will be most effective in a given fight. Outside of missions, there are a few other activities the game will present you with, some of which are unlocked after progressing past certain points in the game. As I had mentioned, a big part of this game is building your AC, and it's something you will likely spend a lot of time on, if for nothing else than the trial and error required to beat some of the game's harder missions. This part of the game develops slowly, being driven by a shop that requires you to spend your hard-earned credits carefully on parts that will give you an edge. This is tempered a bit further by the fact that most of the parts in the game will require you to beat most of the game to unlock them. You can find some parts in missions, and you'll earn some by collecting logs, but you'll find most of them will need to be purchased in shop, and only after beating the required missions for unlock. A small gripe I have with the customization is simply that there is a large variety of weapons and parts available, but a lot of them, outside of presenting a particular aesthetic, aren't necessarily worth using. Depending on the weapon, this could be due to clunkiness or slow fire rate, such as the case with grenade launchers, or just low overall performance in terms of damage, like some of the machine guns. Armor pieces are much the same here, with most of them serving as platforms for progression in your first playthrough, and shiny, neat-looking collectibles after you've already beaten the game and crafted a build which works for just about everything. Miles may vary in PvP, but on my second and third playthroughs, I ended up sticking with one primary build and only swapping a few parts here and there as needed. Another activity you'll want to make sure you keep up with is the Arena. This is essentially an AI-powered introduction into how the multiplayer for this game works. The developers have designed a long list of encounters which they will give to you in increments of 3 to 5 challenges at a time. More challenging encounters are unlocked as you progress farther through the game, and beating a challenge rewards you with OS chips, some credits, and once you've beaten them all, some AC parts. These Arena challenges are essentially just you testing your build and skill against another AC which has been pre-constructed. Although, unlike many challenges in missions, these ACs will actually use weapons and armor that you also have access to. This actually makes these challenges really fun and interesting as you begin to recognize what you'll be up against just by its visual presentation before it even starts firing at you. As I mentioned, you'll be rewarded with credits and parts, but you'll also be given a currency called OS chips. These are spent on a system called OS tuning, which is essentially an upgrade tree for various aspects of your AC. You can increase your damage with various weapon types, decrease the damage you take, increase the value of repair kits, and even unlock special abilities like being able to start a mission even if your mech is overloaded, purging and abandoning your weapons mid-mission to increase speed, or unlocking special abilities like assault or pulse armor. The OS tuning system is almost as essential as picking your mech parts, so I highly recommend you do each and every Arena encounter whenever they're available. You're gonna need that boost in power for later parts of the game. Now, there is PvP multiplayer in this game. It is similar to how the Arena system works, except the only rewards are bragging rights. You'll play against other players who have meticulously customized their own ACs. Lobbies can hold anywhere from 2 to 6 players, and you'll play matches against each other on a rotating basis, 1 versus 1. You also have a log which records your match history, both victories and defeats. Honestly, I didn't spend a lot of time with this part of the game, as I do consider it to be the least interesting, just my opinion. It's a bit repetitive and will inevitably become meta-focused, as all online PvP games tend to do, but it is there, it's FromSoft PvP, and it's probably the best that any PvP has ever been in a FromSoft game. It works well, feels good, and there are no obtuse or esoteric methods for connecting to a match like in some of their other games. If you're a FromSoft PvP veteran and you like the gameplay of AC6, you will definitely love this. One last thing for the gameplay section before we move on, I just want to say that the game is technically flawless. After 30 hours of gameplay and roughly 2.5 total playthroughs, I can confidently say that I did not encounter a single bug or technical issue that ruined or even damaged my playthrough. The only thing that I'll mention is more of a performance-based note, and it's not even the game's fault. I ran Armored Core 6 on a Razer Blade 15 2020 model laptop with an RTX 2070 Max-Q Power GPU and an Intel i7-10750H CPU. I have 32 gigabytes of 3600 speed RAM in this thing, and I run all of my applications on 2 M2 SSDs. At 1080p, this game ran a flawless 60 FPS or higher at almost all times. There were a couple of missions where frames dropped below 60 for short periods of time, but this is due to my hardware, not the game itself. As far as technical experience is concerned, AC6 has been absolutely perfect. Alright, let's talk about the story and narrative. I don't think I'll have another section in this video nearly as long as the gameplay, since I consider the gameplay to be the most important and also the most fun part of this game, but the other aspects of AC6 are still worth mentioning in greater detail. Overall, I enjoyed the story in this game. I thought it was well done, aside from a minor plot device towards the very end. The story itself is mostly linear, although there are 3 different endings which are determined by choices that the player will make in a couple of the chapters. You can unlock all 3 endings without having to restart the game, which is basically an NG Plus or NG++ system. But you will have to pay attention to the choices you're making in order to get the ending you're after. If you get to the point where you choose to help one faction, you'll want to make the opposite choice in your next playthrough. Notably, the 3rd ending is actually quite unique in this regard, as it requires you to complete the previous 2 endings before the missions that trigger the 3rd ending become available. This is also the most difficult ending to achieve in the game, so there's definitely some merit to it. I don't really want to discuss too much of the story's events, as I feel it would spoil it for anyone who hasn't played through it completely yet. I will say that your role and the choices you make do play a critical part in the outcome, though it doesn't actually change the overall motifs of desperation, themes of free will, and corporate greed. In the midst of all this, you are a seemingly random mercenary who has been given the task by your handler, Walter, to land on Rubicon and find a license under which you can begin to perform independent mercenary work. Your official call sign will be RB-23 Raven, or 621. But who is Walter, and why would you want to be on Rubicon performing mercenary work? What makes Rubicon so special anyway? These are questions the setup will inevitably have the player asking, and handler Walter, as if expecting the player to react this way, is quick to assure you that it's just a job, 621. All of it. Walter will be by your side, helping you line up work to get your name out there, slowly building rep with the factions of Rubicon, each with their own aims and goals. You'll meet a fairly large cast of characters on the way, some mysterious, some shifty, others wholesome, and only trying to do what they think is best for the planet. All in all, at least for the 2 endings I've gotten so far, the plot has been great, and I think adding the elements of player choice have made playing this game multiple times all the better for it. I personally also really loved the voice cast for this game. I know some people have said the voice acting is bad, but I think the cocky swagger and militant-leaning attitude of the characters is an absolutely perfect setup, especially when the plot turns towards its more bleak and desperate atmosphere towards the end. You'll really notice and feel the shift in mindset, trust, and desire to win their respective causes in the characters by this point in the game, and the previously hammy voice acting actually does well to accomplish this. The story itself is delivered primarily through dialogue, although you can find quite a number of text logs which can add context to the events you're playing through or the history you're learning about. Some characters will talk to you mid-mission through a comms system that attempts to blend the exposition with the suspension of your disbelief, and it works just fine. When you're fighting an enemy AC, you'll sometimes get reactive dialogue, and this often helps build characters and their relationships to you, the plot, and each other. However, most of the story and almost all of its impactful moments will be delivered to you in pre-mission briefs and post-mission debriefs. These are typically short but direct sequences where character handles will appear on screen, directing the conversation to you or each other. And it is in these short sequences where you will find the vast majority of plot-focused exposition, especially towards the latter half of the game, where your reason for being on Rubicon becomes more and more clear. Now, I wouldn't call the plot for this game an Academy Award winner, but it gets the job done. It's a good story with a couple of variable endings which all end up feeling unique and credible. I do have a few minor complaints, like your choices really only having an impact on how the game ends, or the last chapter having a few minor MacGuffins or plot holes. But the bond you'll feel with the characters you've been working with for the entire game tends to overshadow those moments. Altogether, I think the story for AC6 is great and serves adequately as a satisfying vehicle for its mech gameplay. Now, on to the graphics, performance, and technical stuff. As far as my setup is concerned, it's pretty mid, maybe even a bit low-end by today's standards. I ran the game at 1080p on medium settings, and I used my laptop monitor, a 24-inch 60Hz desktop monitor, and a 40-inch 60Hz smart TV. It performed flawlessly in every setup, only stuttering a few frames at very specific points on very specific missions. Those frame drops in particular did repeat themselves on all 3 of my playthroughs, so I know it's not the game's fault here. I have to emphasize my impression of the technical performance here. While my setup isn't exactly cutting edge, it's also not so outdated that I couldn't play this game. This surprises me because FromSoft's other most recent game, Elden Ring, had very similar PC requirements, but it is more difficult for my PC to run. I figured AC6 would present me with similar issues, given how fast-paced the combat is and how many particle effects you'll be seeing on screen. And while this did come up on extremely specific occasions, looking at you, final boss fights, It did not stop me from completing the game, and really only dampened my experience a small amount. If it weren't for trying to detail this review as much as possible, I wouldn't even mention it. Playing on a rig such as mine does provide me with a couple of benefits. You, the audience, will know that this game can run flawlessly and look pretty decent doing it on old hardware, and you'll also know that if you have a rig which is better than mine, you'll get the same or better performance and visuals. All told, AC6 was damn near technically flawless for me. As for art style, that's a bit of a different discussion. Now, I love the setting and the lore for this game, and the scale on which the conflict plays out is simply ridiculous and incredible. And when you see a set piece colored by the coral and outlined by the hyper-futuristic, massive brutalist architecture, it's just beautiful and awe-inspiring. The mech designs are also fantastic, combining sleek and fast-looking parts and weapons with more heavy, clunky, and old-looking ones. There's a huge variety here, and each character who has an AC representation in the game is made all the more whole and unique for it. However, the general environments in this game do leave a bit to be desired. And don't get me wrong, I understand that the backdrop is not necessarily the focus for the game, it's just that, a backdrop for the gameplay. But the near ubiquitous grays of buildings and structures, and whites of snow and ash are just a bit bland in what is otherwise a very colorful game. This is another thing I wouldn't really bother mentioning casually, as it doesn't truly detract from the experience. Your focus will be on how badass your mech's super vibrant or old and rusty paint job looks, while you're firing off blinding blue plasma lasers and the barrels of your Gatling guns turn red from expending 100 rounds in a flash. The game leaves you very little time to actually stop and look closely at the environments. But if you do, one can't help but notice that they are decidedly bland most of the time. Next, we'll talk about sound, voice acting, and music for a minute. As I had mentioned previously, I have no issues with the voice acting, although you may find it cheesy, hammy, or perhaps a bit too anime. I'm fine with all that. I love the seriousness and tone, bordering on goofy for some characters, and you really start to feel their desperation and desire to win towards the end of the game. In terms of music, AC6 has a very subtle score. For me, the most impactful music in the game has to be the intro music when you hit the main menu, but there are a few missions which take the drama of orchestra and combine it with an electronic beat to great effect. The issue with sound in this game is that it mostly focuses on sound effects, being that the primary goal is to deliver an experience that makes you feel like a mech pilot. Now, the game does succeed in this regard. Missiles and rockets launch with an explosive whoosh that feels weighty. Grenade launchers deliver a satisfying thump followed up by a booming explosion. Laser and plasma cannons do laser and plasma cannon things. And, of course, Gatling guns go brrrr. It all comes together nicely, though I will say I never actually tracked down a gameplay element by hearing it like I have in many other games. That is to say, you won't necessarily detect a missile being launched at you by the unique sound they make alone. This is partly because there is almost always a lot happening on screen in both sound and visual, so it would be difficult to parse naturally, but in addition to this, anytime you are targeted with a lock-on strike, as is the case with most missile weapons, you'll hear some warning beeps and see a big red warning square on your target. So, while the game's sound does come together nicely, creating a soundscape that adds a ton of immersion to what it might feel like to pilot a giant shooty death machine, there isn't really any stage here which allows you to apply your knowledge of the sound to how you play the game. Not a huge complaint, but something to take note of. One thing I would warn about is that combat in this game can be very loud and very involved sound-wise, especially on some of the more difficult boss encounters and later levels. Despite this, I never experienced a single moment of dialogue or music overlap, so I'd say that the sound in this game is majorly successful. To cap this review off, I'm going to finish up by talking about the length of the game and some more of my final thoughts. This section is where gameplay really matters. This game can be very long and difficult if you let it be. It can also be extremely short and easy if you let it be. For example, my first playthrough, which had the most variability in my playstyle, due to just not knowing what builds were best or not having the parts unlocked, took me about 17 to 19 hours. By contrast, my second playthrough, where I had a complete build and complete knowledge of every boss fight, took me roughly 10 hours. The build and boss knowledge do combine and go a long way to making your subsequent playthroughs faster and easier. The increase in playtime on my first playthrough is most certainly due to not recognizing and understanding game mechanics and just simply getting stuck on a few of the more difficult encounters. Once I had that knowledge, the game became an absolute breeze, and I only changed parts on my second playthrough a small number of times, completing the majority of the game with a single build. There are 3 total endings to this game, as well as a bunch of arena fights to complete and combat logs to collect. Taken a step further, you may also be interested in earning enough credits to buy out the entire shop. I would say time to complete this game in its entirety with all endings, fights, logs, and parts collected would take you anywhere between 40 and 60 hours. This will depend, of course, greatly on your skill and understanding of game mechanics, and I'm sure some people out there can do it faster. I didn't start skipping story sequences until my 3rd playthrough, as the story is exactly the same outside of the alternative missions which serve as vehicles for the different endings. However, this game does have online multiplayer, and if you're the kind of person who would get enjoyment out of endlessly customizing your mech builds, parts, and paint styles, then pitting your creations against other players in combat, this game could very well be endless for you. I and a couple of my friends have put hundreds of hours into PvP across all of FromSoft's games, and it's pretty much the best it's ever been in this game here. So, do I recommend Armored Core 6 after all? Yes, I very much recommend Armored Core 6, even with what flaws it has. I still hold by what I said at the top of the video, but I want to go a little more in depth here to close out this review. I look at this game the same way I look at Dark Souls. It's a completely solid, inside and out, single-player adventure with brutal challenges, tons of character customization opportunity, and incentive to replay it multiple times. While Dark Souls isn't really a mission-based game and doesn't demand as much attention to precise build play, the focused gameplay design mirrors that of AC6 exceptionally closely. And this surprises me because Elden Ring is easily FromSoft's most successful game. While I understand that hardcore AC fans are not all satisfied with the liberties taken in this entry, I'm still surprised that it ended up closer to Dark Souls than it did to Elden Ring. These titles likely developed side by side, so you would think it would have been easy to ape some of those elements from Elden Ring and put them here in AC6. The decision not to do that, or maybe lack of awareness to its possibility, is only to the benefit of AC6 in my opinion. I am glad this game is short, focused, and complete. I am glad it's not another open world forever game. And I hope this sends a message, at least in some small part, to the industry at large that there is still a place in it for games like AC6. Make no mistake, this game will not sell anywhere near the same as Elden Ring, but Armored Core 6's place next to Elden Ring as a phenomenal and worthy entry into FromSoft's catalog is no less deserved. So, if you've made it this far, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this review. If you did, I would appreciate your support, even if it's as simple as some feedback in the comments, a like, or a sub. If you like AC6 and mech games in general, please enjoy this brief shout out to a game that I love, which just might be your next favorite thing. This is a game called Brigador, and it's a top-down mech game where you play as a mercenary doing mercenary things with combat mechs for credits. It's got all the same vibes and attitude as AC6, but presents a unique perspective and gameplay loop with its own narrative and lore. Definitely worth a look if you're looking for more mech games. If you have made it this far, please accept my sincerest gratitude. It means a lot that you would be this interested in my work here. There will be more to come with many different games and discussions to be had, but until then, just thank you so much for being here. And until next time, be careful out there, Raven.